And we're on. Perfect. Hello, 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 guys. Welcome to this new edition of Mind Podcast. We're doing a special India-Australia World Cup podcast, and joining me is podcaster, analyst, commentator, and our good friend from Sydney, Paul Dennett. Hey, Paul. Welcome to Mind Podcast again.
Thanks for having me, Aadit. How are you going?
Pretty good, pretty good. Not too bad. Now that the World Cup sort of the madness around the World Cup has gone down, the heartbreak of the final has reduced. But what a game! And man, I mean, first of all, congratulations to Australia. Brilliant win for you guys. I mean, I know every commentator was trying to make it a big thing after India posted 240, say, oh, India has a chance. But we Indians in our heart knew that 240 was not enough on that track or with the conditions. So your initial thoughts about the World Cup final before we get into the whole tournament?
Well, just one thing I'll say on that is that when Australia was 3 for 40 odd in the runs chase, Australia actually went out to talking in Australian odds. I don't know how to convert this to American odds, but $4.50 underdogs. So they were India were very, very strong favourites at that point, and it felt like India were probably going to win. But my overall impression was I was really very satisfying as an Australian fan to see the results. I think that of the 6 World Cups that Australia has now won, this is the most I suppose most pleasing in many ways. I don't think it's the best team that we've had, although it's a very, very good team. And I think that the 1987 World Cup, Australia went in as rampant underdogs because we'd had a very poor period. So no one gave Australia a chance of winning that World Cup. Australia were a much more highly fancied chance of winning this particular one. But I just think that ultimately beating the Indian side, who had been undefeated throughout the World Cup, a fantastic team, in all the advantages and everything in the pitch and in front of the big crowd at the Modi Stadium and everything else. I think it was a very satisfying win. And I think that the Pat Cummins, the bravery he showed at the toss, the way that he kind of carried himself, knowing the criticism that was going to come his way if it went wrong, was superb. And I think hopefully it has silenced some of the silly criticism that was surrounding him in Australia prior to this tournament.
I think India was out-captained by Pat Cummins. I mean, no question about it, because his decision to stick with Maxwell and that the Australian fielding. So I actually said this before when I was doing another podcast, and someone asked me, what do you think about Australia? And I told them that this is giving me the 1999 vibes, where Steve Waugh's catch was dropped by Herschel Gibbs. You can go to the Wankhede and Glenn Maxwell's catch being dropped by Mujibur Rahman, and then with one leg and about 125% adrenaline, he played one of the biggest knocks. But if I were to draw a parallel with the World Cups, this almost seemed like India's 1983 World Cup victory, because you had one wild innings like Kapil Dev's 175 against Zimbabwe, Glenn Maxwell's 200 against Afghanistan. The West Indies, I think, was a far stronger team than the Indian team in 1983. Similarly, Australia was dangerous, but I think India was a far stronger team. But then, given the conditions and the slowness of the track, the Australians exploited that beautifully. And go back to 1983, the track was seaming and, around. So a Madan Lal at 130 kilometers an hour is equally potent to Michael Holding. Maybe not as potent, but suddenly becomes a wicket-taking option in England. So it almost seemed like, I would say Australia in the odds was slightly higher than India was in 1983, but they almost came out of nowhere given the 2 losses in the first 2 games.
It's funny because the thing that people forget is that India actually beat West Indies in the pool game in 1983 as well.
Exactly, yes.
But yeah, I was too young. I was alive, but too young to remember the 83 World Cup final. I like to think if I'd been an adult with a sports betting account that I would have had some money on India at good odds, expecting that the pitch was going to get
swing
low and slow. Whether I would have or not, I'm not sure. But yeah, I can see some parallels there. Although I think that probably the nominal gap between the two sides, as you said, is lower. That Australia, I think player for player, India is a better side, and that was shown throughout the World Cup. But I would also say that probably in the entire every game in the lead up to that, including the semi-final, I would imagine that India was, if you looked at the win predictor, above 50% at all times in every game, with the possible exception of when Kohli top-edged the ball before Mitch Marsh dropped it. If they had calculated it in that 1.2 seconds or whatever it was, I think at that moment, if he'd taken that catch, Australia might have clipped into above 50% in that game. So although in the end it was a comfortable win for India, Australia was kind of showing signs that they could compete with them early on.
Yeah, and it was a very polar opposite situation. If India is chasing 200 and they're 2 for 3, Australia is chasing 247 and they're 47 for 3. And Travis Head plays and misses essentially 2 overs from Jasprit Bumrah, where he looked like he was going to take a wicket. Because let's face it, David Warner and Mitch Marsh got out to some pretty ordinary deliveries. But then Steve Smith got an absolute Jaffa, and he was obviously not out, but he was so angry with himself that how did he miss? He never reviewed it. So every Indian I'm probably sure there's 100,000 cuss words rising up from Australia at that time saying, why didn't this bugger review the damn LBW?
Yeah, I mean, I was watching it, and as soon as it hit his pad, I shut my eyes and looked up at the ceiling, waiting for the roar, because I didn't even think whether I thought it was out or not. I just knew the umpire was going to give it out. And I was looking up, and sure enough, half a second later, the roar came. And I just assumed that he would review it because, he always does. But I think I thought that it was either going to be a red light on impact or an orange light on impact. And so, in hindsight, yes, he should have reviewed it. But probably at the time, I could see why he didn't. So, yeah.
Well, also, I think the reaction now is more funny because Australia won. Had they lost, oh boy, that would have been a big... It's akin to what India's reaction was to Rohit Sharma's shot.
Yeah. The crazy thing is, had he reviewed it and history went down a different pathway, who knows? India might have won. Like, it's crazy.
Yeah. Who knows? Yeah, anything could have happened. But, so I have to ask you one thing. And before we'll do, I know this is a short one. We'll record a longer one in the, days to come. But before I get into your take on the World Cup, I have to ask you a question. A lot of people, and I actually pushed back on a lot of criticisms that said, this World Cup not a lot of people in Australia were seeing it. Man, I was looking at the viewership ratings on 9, and they had more than 47% of the audience tuned in. And that's not even including people in bars and streaming on their phones and stuff. So, I mean, I think the viewership was pretty high in Australia, right? For the World Cup final. What would you say, you being there?
Yeah, I mean, for the final, certainly it was very high. I actually sent out a tweet early on in the tournament. I was at a pub watching the New Zealand game, and at the start of the runs chase, they took it off the big screen and put on a rugby league international, ironically, that was between Australia and New Zealand. And then the cricket was on a little screen, and then after the rugby league finished, it got put back on the main screen. And a lot of people overseas were saying, "Oh, this shows that Australia's lost interest in cricket and everything else," which is not what I meant it to be. It just shows that rugby league is always the number one sport in Sydney. But I think that about 6 years ago, Channel 9 gave up the rights to domestic cricket in Australia, as sort of a domestic, when I say international cricket in Australia, and it went to Channel 7 and Foxtel. And so for the first time ever, the white ball internationals went behind a paywall. And that was at the same time as one-day cricket in Australia had been plummeting in the terms of people being interested. So that did significant extra damage to the one-day game, because now each summer there's a cohort of Australians who just don't see the Australian one-day side. And so I think that the fact that probably early on in this tournament there wasn't much chatter in Australia isn't because cricket is not a popular sport here. It's because of the damage that had been done to the one-day international format. Secondly, the fact that cricket now has seemingly a world event every 5 minutes has harmed it in Australia. I think there's a difference there with India, where cricket's the number one sport and it's miles ahead of anything else. It doesn't really matter. It's always going to be popular. In Australia, I would class cricket as one of our 3 big sports, but the people do have many, many other sports. And I know there are other sports in India as well, but there's a very, very competitive sporting landscape in Australia. And I think Australian fans get a bit cynical and they say, oh, there's the T20 World Cup, then there's the the World Test Championship. Now there's the 50 over World Cup. Then there's another T20 World Cup also inside the same cycle. They've added the Champions Trophy back in. And I think that it's kind of it's splintered the audience a little bit. But long way of saying, yes, because this World Cup was on Channel 9, it built momentum throughout. And those ratings, you're absolutely right. The ratings for the final were superb, as were the ratings for many of the games in the lead up to the final. So
yeah,
but at the end, it was a success in Australia.
And I was doing the math. I mean, you're talking about 1.1 million, so that's 1.1 billion families. You times it by 4 or 5 or something, and then you add the people watching it in groups or screens, because I have family in Melbourne and Sydney, and they said that in Melbourne there were, like, places where big screens were set up where people were watching the final in the park and stuff. You're looking at least about 8 to 10 million people at one point of time that watched the final. That's a third of Australia.
Well, I mean, I think I'm not sure if it's quite that many, but I think another way of looking at it is to compare it to the shows that it beat. And the second biggest show that night and the third biggest show were the two Channel 9 and Channel 7 newses, and it beat them. It almost doubled them.
Doubled,
and
exactly.
They always win the ratings. The other thing was impressive that I think only 4 shows on the entire night beat the second innings of the cricket. Now, the second innings of the cricket didn't start till about 11:30, and it finished at 3:30. So the ratings deep into the night were absolutely superb. That was the one that was the most impressive to me. Lots of people, I think it was something like 400,000 or 500,000 stayed up. And
that's 400,000 families. So you hope, like, you assume that more than 1 or 2 people were watching.
Well, I think you're
TV.
overestimating. Maybe I think there's a few. Not to put a cliche, it might have been quite a few of them would have been like me, sad men sitting up alone. I tried to get my family to watch it, and I got a little bit of interest. But the other thing that's in defense of that, those ratings are only the 5 big cities. So Australia's strange that we've got 5 big cities, and we sometimes assume that the rest of the country doesn't exist. So those ratings only cover probably half the country. So all things considered, it was a ratings bonanza and success for Channel 9, and shows Australians still do love cricket.
Exactly. Yeah. So that's something I wanted to talk, since you're away. And I'll tell you, I get a unique perspective because I am based in the United States, and US too has 3 big sports. I mean, there's 4. There's also soccer, but no one really, not many people watch it. But essentially,
hello to all ice hockey fans out there.
And that too, yes. But primarily it's NFL, which is the American football, NBA, and Major League Baseball. Now, I come from the city of Houston, where baseball is very popular, and Astros have won, twice. But I'm telling you, when NFL comes, which is like, footy for Australia, so NFL season, nothing else gets talked about. Everything else is just a sideshow. And so, and even if the Olympics were happening during NFL season, that's what would happen. And America usually is at the top. So it's not like Americans don't care about Olympics. It's just NFL is just going to, root the ratings. So I completely understand. But, moving to the World Cup itself, who are your standout performers if we go beyond India and Australia from the other teams? And what are your biggest memories from this World Cup?
The standout performers, I think, obviously Afghanistan, and the fact that they really came of age, and had they beaten Australia, would have then had the game against South Africa. Basically, if they won that, then they would have been into the semi-finals. I think that was an extraordinary achievement. I think South Africa performed well. People will say,
I was just going to say.
Yeah, people will say yet again South Africa lost in a semi-final, or found a way to not perform. But I think I don't think that they choked. I just think they lost a close game, and it could have gone either way. Maybe you could argue that Bavuma was too generous in terms of putting the field back and allowing Australia easy singles. But I think that South Africa performed particularly well.
I think Bavuma was generous at the toss, giving Australia bowlers those conditions to bowl at. I mean,
yes, potentially.
It reminded me of that Australia-West Indies 96 semi-final. If you remember, when Australia was like 15 odd for 4, and then, but then that's the difference between Shane Warne and the rest of the world. Like, Shane Warne just decided single-handedly that he's going to, engineer a West Indian collapse. By the way, at one point of time when Keshav Maharaj was bowling, I was worried that you guys might lose a couple more wickets the way they were going.
Oh, for sure. I mean, I gave South Africa a huge chance of winning, and it was very gratifying that we managed to hold on in both the semi and the final. I could have seen it go down a very different path, and I've seen Australian sides many times have that happen. So yeah, I think South Africa and Afghanistan were probably my two standouts outside Australia and India. I mean, New Zealand performed well as they often do.
Yeah, New Zealand is this savings bank account. It'll always give you 5% interest, depending on whatever the economy. They're always going to go to the semifinal, and then you have to see if there's a stock market boost, they'll make it to the final. But poor guys have been unlucky when it comes to. I mean, hey, when Daryl Mitchell and Kane Williamson were going, every Indian I know was. I mean, I can show you some of the WhatsApp chats, and I'll probably get banned on YouTube if I show so many curse words in one screenshot. People were scared because New Zealand.
Yeah, I'd had a little bit of money on New Zealand, and I can't remember the odds, but they were extraordinary odds because people gave them no chance. But I just thought the pitch is going to flatten out, and anything is possible. And it was noticeable, even Sanjay Manjrekar and others in commentary, that you could see how the Indians' nerves were starting to get tested. And it was still before there was a real likelihood of New Zealand winning. It needed everything to go right. But for just actually, it was actually as the ball left Kane Williamson's bat on the actual ball that he got out, and I thought it was going for 6. I was thinking, geez, this is starting to get interesting. And then he got caught on the boundary.
Yeah,
and my money was lost. So
I think I think Jimmy Neesham was not picked as well, which was kind of shocking. And they went with Chapman. I was like, Jimmy Neesham almost single-handedly won them the game against Australia in Dharamsala. And he has played for the Mumbai Indians before and the IPL. He knows the ground. He knows how because Wankhede is it almost is a more refined version of the Eden Park in Auckland. I'm not going to say it's that small, but it has curious angles. It has very short, straight boundaries. But Kane Williamson found out those square boundaries are not that small. So you chip it for a 60-meter 6. Nope, it's about 75 meters long, and you're going to get caught.
Yes, and the water on the outside as well causes a bit of a microclimate and stuff. But I completely agree. I couldn't believe they didn't pick Neesham, and I wouldn't have dropped Chapman. I would have omitted bloody Lockie Ferguson or Latham. I think that Lockie Ferguson's the sort of bowler that looks fantastic, but on a ground that predominantly does have small boundaries, the margin for error is just too small. And I would prefer Neesham's bowling apart from even his batting.
Gujarat Titans realized that in one season we traded away Rocky Ferguson because of that exact reason, because he's going to bowl 8 matches in Ahmedabad, and strangely, except for the final, it's a pretty good wicket in Ahmedabad to bat on. So that's another perplexing decision. Whoever made, if they did in the BCCI or something about choosing a black soil wicket, they probably ought to be fired because India just, gave up the advantage. It should have been played on a fresh wicket. So,
well, I mean, the pitches, it was strange that, and I don't know what your view of it is, but I think that India lost a lot of respect around the world for the way that they carried on with the pitches in the semi-final and the final, and it also was to their detriment.
Actually, that is assuming it had not lost enough respect, BCCI as well, for the ticketing fiasco. So in my opinion, and I have been very vocal about it, I think BCCI has done good things for the players, making cricket a career and stuff. But man, administratively, they dropped the ball big time on this World Cup. If you want it to be a World Cup and want people from other countries to come, this was a bit of a joke. What happened with the tickets? So
yeah, and I think that Michael Vaughan made a really good point on the BBC that cricket is so lucky to have India, and that to have 1.4 billion people who love, not everyone loves it, but to have that country as the national sport, and it's massively popular. If we didn't have India, then cricket would be a tiny game in the global village that no one really cared about. As it is, it rivals basketball as the world's second biggest sport, and it's sometimes I think that gets lost, that when people from outside India, we lazily say India when we're criticizing them, but we're really meaning some select administrators. Like the people, the fans, and everything else deserve nothing but praise and respect and love. It's just annoying that, as you say, that the BCCI just didn't put enough effort in to make it a wonderful experience for fans, not only from India, but as you say, from around the world as well.
Yeah, and what happens? It gets confused, right? So I called out Henry Blofeld's ridiculous message where he said India is getting too big for its boots, and I'm like, oh god. So see, I was like, there's some legitimate criticism that what Michael Wan has said, what we're talking about here, but then there's also some old colonial hangover that Mr. Blofeld. So it prompted a Harsha Bhogle who
I saw
never
it. Yeah.
is. He was angry because I think his old BBC memories came out and stuff.
Yeah.
So I think within Indian sports administration and Indian journalism, there needs to be a bifurcation that, okay, there's some nasty things that are going to be said, question them, criticize them, but there's some legit stuff as well. And India cannot. And ultimately, as much as I want other countries to host World Cup, it's every 5 years, one of the big three is always going to be hosting a world event. It's just an inevitability because only India, Australia, and England can ensure regular crowds to every single game. I mean, the West Indies, unfortunately, I'm looking forward to what is going to happen next year in the US and the West Indies in terms of the crowds with the T20 World Cup. So I hope they show up. But it's just if that's going to happen, I think we need to do a better job at the whole ticketing thing, and this
Yeah.
cannot happen.
For sure.
But moving in the last, because I know we're on a timeline crunch. So last 5 minutes, I want to say quick things about the India-Australia final, and where do you see the future of ODI cricket from here?
It's a good question. I think the second half of the tournament was very important for the future of one-day cricket because I think that the first half, apart from anything else, there weren't close games, and I still think. I mean, I grew up loving one-day cricket, and
Yeah.
the last few games of the World Cup, reminded me of how much I had once loved it, and how wonderful the format can be. But I
Right.
suppose if I'm being honest, if you looked at me during a random game in this World Cup between, Team A and Team B, neither of whom are Australia, versus my interest level in the equivalent game in the T20 World Cup, I'm probably more interested in the T20 World Cup because I just do think that once the power play ends, there's that period where it does drift a little bit, where it's in the batting team's interests to not take too many risks, and yet the bowling side doesn't bring the field up, so you end up getting overs where often there are kind of 5 or 6 singles taken without much jeopardy either way. That can get a little bit dull. And I think the other thing is that obviously, with there being very few games in this World Cup of of being genuine knockout games, that also added to that. So I think I would like to hope that the 50 over World Cup can continue long and strong as it is. And I've actually changed my tune on that. Halfway through the tournament, I had been saying I think they need to just admit whether it's going and make the next 50 over World Cup a 20 over World Cup, combine the history and just go from there. But now I've changed my mind on that. I really do hope that the 50 over World Cup continues. I hope that the Champions Trophy is a success when it comes back. But as for bilateral 50 over cricket, I see how Mark Nicholas, now new head of the MCC, wants it ended. I don't think it's probably going to be ended soon, but I think it's going to be downsized significantly. And maybe that's not a bad thing. If they can have less and it means more, then I still think there's a future for it.
I'll tell you something before we end. Like my perspective on this would be, I think we need to move into a FIFA qualifier type of situation for 50 over World Cup as well, where every single team is playing, not just the test nations. And that's the only thing. And then you can have international friendlies like they have just for the 50 over format. So each game is significant when they're playing. And the second thing I would say is bring back the quarterfinals. And for South Africa, if you're doing 7 teams, don't do that nonsense of Super Six. I hated that concept where you're taking the top 3 and doing all sorts of jigsaw puzzle with points. No, best of 3 finals are no fun. World Cups are fun because every team has to show up on those days and absorb the pressure. It's not a league. That's why you have the IPL or the Big Bash League or a test series where, the best team take. World Cup is supposed to be that extra excitement. So I hope that in South Africa, the 7 teams come, the quarterfinals come. So there are 7 qualifying games and not more. And each team is playing 6, and bring more doubleheaders in. And another thing, Paul, also expecting kids these days to have 8 hours in front of a TV is a bit much too. I mean, I think we grew up in different times. Now I want to say that it was a lot more laid back now it is, but it's going to get inevitably compared to a game of footy or NFL, which only lasts 3 hours.
Yeah, it's an interesting couple of points you make there, because I'll take you up on a couple of them, and I've got a couple more minutes still.
Yeah.
That the notion of having every game between the World Cup counting as a qualifier for the World Cup, I, in principle, agree with that. But the risk of doing that is that if something goes wrong and if India were to not qualify, then the World Cup becomes a financial joke and a disaster. And I just don't know how they get around that. If I was a broadcaster and I was looking to bid for the World Cup, even if it's highly unlikely that India won't qualify, strange things happen in sport, and it's that level of concern that maybe they won't qualify. Plus, to go the opposite way, at the actual World Cup itself, the problem with quarterfinals is usually, and I know that the associate teams are making great strides, but usually there's about 8 sides that are kind of, you can pencil into the quarterfinals before the tournament begins. And I take you back to the 2015 World Cup, and before the tournament, you could name the 8 sides who are going to make it. As it turned out, 7 of those 8 did make it, and the one that didn't, England being knocked off by Bangladesh, resulted in basically everyone being sacked and a wholesale change in their cricket, and it was a catastrophe. So it took a catastrophe for one of the expected quarterfinalists not to make it. So my problem with when you've got a group of 7 being whittled down to a final 4 to go into quarterfinals, that you at the end of it, you sort of say, oh, those are the 4 that made it. I kind of knew that before the tournament. And again, that means that there aren't that many games that really matter. And I know that I sound like I'm contradicting myself, because yes, there can be upsets, but there needs to be quite a few upsets for one of the big teams to not then make it through.
Yeah, but I think Afghanistan this year gives me some hope, and Netherlands too. Let's not forget them beating South Africa, running Sri Lanka close, them convincingly beating Bangladesh. And what's interesting, I mean, this is probably one of the worst World Cups for Bangladesh cricket, where they just, not only that, they had to deal with Sakib Al Hasan's temper tantrums.
Yeah.
and the whole timed out fiasco and stuff. But given the fact, and given that, I think cricket might be in good hands with the associates doing well. I think next year's T20 World Cup is a big one, because 20 teams are going to play. That is going to be huge. And for once, I actually get to watch the action live, because one of the venues is just about 200 miles north of where I stay in Dallas. So I'm kind of excited and I'm hoping that, they give like an associate game. So I get to see like a, Netherlands team or an Afghanistan team, just to see how it'll be interesting to see how they play. But I think a lot of upsets are coming up in the next World Cup, because the shorter the format, the wilder it gets.
Yeah, and I'm really happy that they're going to have a proper, like the previous T20 World Cups, where they've had half the teams are kind of having to have in that preliminary qualifying tournament. That was a good idea, I get it, but I just think it's far better. Go with everyone, and everyone starts equally. And you're right, there'll be some upsets, and T20, it doesn't matter if it's not an upset, or if it's a thrashing. Well, it's over pretty quickly. So I'm really excited for it. I mean, my only criticism of it is that the fact that there are 2 of them every 4 years, plus the World Cup, plus the Champions Trophy and the World Test Championship. It does dilute it a little bit, but it'll be interesting to see. I presume that the American games will be in small stadiums and will get good crowds, and they'll be mainly Indians and Pakistani expats turning up, but still, you got to start.
Well, you'd be surprised. A lot of British expats, Australian expats, and stuff are especially there. So the cities they've picked are very interesting. In New York is a big one. I think they're expecting it's going to be like a 30,000 capacity stadium, 34,000 part. And then Florida and Dallas both have very strong expat populations. So it's going to be interesting. And the other thing, and we'll wrap up here. The other interesting thing is that they're not going to have, they're going to have countries like Papua New Guinea, Ireland and Scotland, both are going to be there. Afghanistan and Bangladesh both are going to be there. Nepal and Oman, and then we'll find out in Africa, which most likely Zimbabwe will be there, but we'll find out if Kenya is coming or not. I'm going to tell you one thing, that right now Kenya and Rwanda are leading one side of the table, Tanzania and Nigeria the other end, and Zimbabwe and another team, Uganda. So it's completely wild what's going to happen, but who knows? We might see a lot of new and the ultimate interesting thing is United States as a team. So I want to see how ESPN, who has the rights to broadcast, how they sponsor that. Because if US comes into cricket, suddenly there's a whole new market.
Yeah, for
with that.
sure. I mean, I think Major League Cricket was a big success in its first year, and I think it's going to build on that. So, yeah, it's exciting times. The
Yeah,
what FIFA always has done well has been to say, let's, they gave Africa and Asia more teams than they probably initially deserved, but then those teams have grown into those spots. And cricket's kind of gone the other way, that you've had to fight tooth and nail to get a seat with at the big
yeah.
boys table. So yeah, it should be a really good
But
World Cup in
and
June
three
next year.
big and this reminds me of the 2003 South Africa, where they had their World Cup, and then 2006 FIFA. In US, the same thing, 2024, and then 2026 FIFA, and then the other big one, 2028 Olympics, Los Angeles, first time cricket in the Olympics. So if they can keep up the momentum, they can get about 4 good years of this.
Yeah, first time since 1900. It was there once.
First time, yes. England, France.
Yes. Except
Maybe
the two
we
teams were both English teams.
Oh, really? I
The
had no
French team
idea.
was the French team was English workers building the Eiffel Tower, expats.
Wow. Who knew?
And neither team knew they were at the Olympics because there was the World's Fair was on at the same time. So they just thought they were having a game of cricket. And then 10 years later, they got retrospectively awarded gold medals.
Oh, wow. What a story. What a story to end this on. Well, thank you so much, Paul. You've been very kind with your time, and I'm so glad we, ended on this. Congratulations to Australia again. I think it's great. India and Australia are playing in 5 hours, apparently.
Yeah, I know.
Again, on a T20 series,
mad.
which no Indian or Australian fan seems to be interested, unless those who are contacted by the host broadcaster to talk about the series. But
Yes.
we'll see. I'll just keep up the score and stuff. I'll just be glad about one thing. When the cup happens in US, both people in US and Australia will not have to wake up at strange times to watch the game. We can actually watch it at reasonable times.
The only thing with that is that then it gets in the way of work. At least when it's in the middle of the night, I know that my only problem is tiredness, rather than having to get that.
Yeah. So that is a significant problem, but hopefully, I'll have the match tickets to get out of work or something, get a good excuse out of it. So, all right. Well, I appreciate it, Paul. Congratulations to Australia again.
Thanks
Great
very much
for y'all. And we'll be back soon, guys. Please follow Paul. I will tag him from Twitter, and like, share, subscribe, and please follow all his work. Till then, it's goodbye and good night from all of us.